Good morning, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us today. I first want to give honor to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, for whom all my blessings flow. And so I'm so grateful to be with each and every one of you here today. My name is Wendy Gladney, Dean, and I'm also known as the Forgiveness Coach. And I feel so humbled because I also am in the presence of Miss Deborah Pregay, who also does so much around the subject of forgiveness. But I'll be sharing with each and every one of you why this subject is so near and dear to my heart. And I'm blessed because every week I get to write a column for two different newspapers, the Los Angeles Sentinel and the Inland Valley News, where I talk about forgiveness and I talk about what's happening in our community. And each Thursday I'm also on KGLH on Front Page with Dominique DePrima at 4:30 in the morning, in case you're up. So it's such a blessing. I've been doing it for almost 6 years, and so I feel grateful to be part of all of those families in terms of the newspaper and the radio. So today I'm going to share with you various things on the subject of living victoriously through the power of forgiveness. And I'm going to share a little bit about my story, and I'm going to also share with you why I think it's so important, especially for us as women, to make sure that we plant the seed of forgiveness in our hearts, because we are the core of families. We're also the core of community, and we're also the core of the work and the jobs that we go out into in the world every single day. And when we carry unforgiveness, it really sets the tone for so many things and the decisions and the choices that we make. So I want to share with you why I think it is so important for us, especially as women, and also as Christian women, because sometimes, believe it or not, even as Christian women, so many people hold grudges, so many people don't understand what it means to forgive, and also the power that you will have when you're dealing with other people when you have that seed. I'm also going to share a little bit about the fact that some people think that when you do forgive, you have to forget. I talk about that. Also, people think that when you forgive, that you're saying that that person who maybe wronged you really you should hold a grudge or something, or that you shouldn't pardon them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to give you 10 steps before we leave that I feel that you can keep and hold and walk away with that will make a difference in your life. So just to give you a little background so that you'll understand how, because people always ask me, why do you talk so boldly about forgiveness? And what do you know about your life in terms of understanding how to share with others what forgiveness has done and what it has meant for you? At the end, I'll try to leave a little bit of time for Q&A before we leave, because I think that sometimes when we're able to have the ability to talk with one another, sometimes it may not even be me that gives the answer. It may be someone else in the audience. But when God brings us together, He always has an answer for us. So I will begin with my life. As a child, most of you maybe can tell by looking at me, I'm biracial. My birth mother's white, my father's African American. And my mother, when I was a very little girl, she ended up letting me go. She ended up abandoning me. And for those of you, I'm 54 years old. So I was born in the early 60s, 1961. So we all know what was happening in the 60s and what was happening with segregation and with racism, and not that it's not happening today, because we're experiencing so many things today as well. But during that time, my mother came from a family. My grandfather was actually a Lutheran pastor. So my grandfather actually preached brotherly love from the pulpit, but when my mother brought home a black husband and a black child, it was not welcome. So my mother didn't know how to deal with that. She was very young. My mother was 18 years old. And if we're just going to be real, the whole bottom line is my father at the time was an entertainer. My mother was a groupie. My mother got pregnant. My father's mother, my grandmother, she made my father marry my mom. She said, son, you lay down with that girl, you're going to stand up with that girl. So that's how my parents got married. That's how they got together. And I was the product of that union. So time would go on. And I know it sounds so funny when you hear things rotely, but it's so true. My mother took me to a friend's house. She said, I'll be back to pick up Wendy, and my mother never came back. The lady actually knew my grandmother. On my father's side, we call her Mother Dear. And so she called my grandmother eventually after a lot of time went by, and she said, Mother Dear, Karen's left Wendy. No one's come to get her. So my grandmother said, I'll come get my baby. So I ended up being raised by my father's family. My father at the time lived in the world. My father had gone from music. My father then began to get involved with drugs. My dad got involved with becoming a pimp and selling drugs, and just became very involved in the streets. So for me, I became a victim of sexual abuse by my father beginning at 6 years old. So from 6 to 16, I was actually a victim of my father. And, you know, during that time, especially within our community, sexual abuse was not something that families talked about very easily. And so it was something that, because people would always ask, well, did you ever talk about that? Did you ever share that? And although I did, it was not something that was easily dealt with within our communities. And then also during that time, my grandmother had 9 children. My father was one of 9. And my father was also one of my grandmother's favorite. So it was also difficult because, you know, how do you deal with that? And my grandmother was also firstborn generation free in our family. My grandmother's father was born a slave and freed as a very little boy. We don't know exactly what age, but somewhere around 4 years old he was freed. But my grandmother was actually the firstborn generation free. And my grandmother was born somewhere right around 1899, somewhere right around there. We're not really sure because when she passed away, she had 3 birth certificates. And so we found out later that with the midwives, they had different birth certificates based on what they needed at the time. So we're not really quite sure. We know a range within 4 or 5 years of when my grandmother was actually born. But she was the product of her father's 2nd marriage, and so her father was older when she was born. So my grandmother was old school. She came from the South. She migrated west, came to California, but she still had the old school values within her, and she didn't know how to deal with the fact of what was happening, of what her son was doing to her granddaughter. So through the years, not having a mother for protection, not having a grandmother of understanding what to do with it. So basically, my grandmother used to always tell me, get an education and get out of here. Basically, as I kept growing, just go away to school, go away to school. I didn't go too far, I went to UCLA, but it was still far enough to get away from the day-to-day actions of my father. So growing up, these are the things that I dealt with. I dealt with understanding what it meant to be abused and abandoned. And also for me, it was difficult because when you're taught or told that you look just like someone you don't remember seeing, you don't have a picture, so you don't really have anything to relate to with that. And then with my father, I didn't know what to do because no matter what happens, children always love their parents. And then the second thing is, where was I going to go? I mean, I'm already within the family that I'm going to live with growing up, so where am I going to go? And people would say, well, there's foster care. Well, you don't understand that as a child. You don't understand any of that. And then the other thing is when you're told that you may be taken away, people always want to stay more where they have a comfort zone of knowing where they're going to be versus the unknown of what might be. So that was what I grew up with. But I'm going to tell you how God can change everything through forgiveness. I'm going to tell you how God can change things through prayer, because eventually, I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but when I was 16 years old, my father had a heart attack. And my father ended up going to the hospital. My grandmother, Mother Dear, she said, Wendy, you need to go see your father. They don't think he's going to make it, and you need to be able to go say goodbye. Now, my grandmother raised me in the church. I was raised in Park Avenue Missionary Baptist Church in Riverside, California. And the very grandmother that raised me in church raised my father in church. And the Word of God tells us that when you train up a child in the way that they should go, that eventually they will come back. Even if they stray, they will come back. So my father, who was also raised in the church, eventually came back. So during the time he was in the hospital, he actually ended up being there for about 30 days. He basically reconnected with the Lord. Now, I didn't understand all of that. I didn't understand what was really going on. I'm 16 years old at the time, going on 17. And then time goes by, my father comes back, and he ends up living with my grandmother for a while during his rehabilitation time after he got out of the hospital. He wasn't married at the time. And so time goes by, and I end up going away to college now. I'm gone to UCLA. And then one day I get this phone call, and it was my father. And my dad said, Wendy, I want to tell you something. I said, yes. He said, God has called me to preach. That's why this book is called The Preacher's Daughter. And I said, Daddy, look, we just wanted you saved. We didn't want you to pimp the church. We didn't want you to start doing all of those things. We just wanted you saved. And he said, no, Wendy, I'm serious. God has called me to ministry and to preach. So over time, I began to understand that God really had touched his life and had a calling on his life. And you know, we have to be careful who we judge, because we think that just because we go to church or we dress right or we act right or read our Bible that we're better than someone else, or that God can use us in a way that he can't use someone else. Let me tell you something, be very careful, because what I learned was my father, he used to, how many in here ever remember the character? I know we all go to church, but how many of us remember the character Superfly? Okay? That is what my father used to look like. Okay, I kid you not. You know, because when after he had his heart attack, before I left to go to college, when he started coming back to church, you know, the church I grew up in had a balcony, and all the kids would sit in the balcony, and everybody else downstairs. And so my dad would walk in with plaid pants, platform shoes, a long leather jacket, a hat cocked to the side with a big old afro, and all the kids would go, "Wendy, your dad's here." Yeah, no kidding. I can see